Welcome to First Reading, the Old Testament lectionary podcast for preachers, teachers, and all of God's creatures. I'm Reverend Dr. Rachel Wren, Assistant Professor of Biblical Studies at Trinity Lutheran Seminary at Capital University.
And I am Paul, as a PhD student of Hebrew Bible at Yale University. Our co-hosts Rosie and Tim are off this week, but we have got you covered. Today's episode features preaching tips and tricks on the LCS text for Sunday, October 29, 2023. Rachel, I think you are up for this week. Where would you like us to start?
I hope I'm up for this week, because otherwise I prepped for nothing. So, so I'm actually going to put us in a place that I don't normally go, Paul, which is the book of Leviticus. So this is the thematic Old Testament reading, not the semi-continuous. And
Right.
You know, Paul, how I'm always saying that like some text or another is one of my all-time favorite Bible texts.
Yeah. You're always talking about the book of Psalms and sometimes Jonah and, all these interesting poetic passages.
Yeah, many Genesis. I mean, I could go on and on. But for the most part, if we're in the book of Leviticus, I'm not normally saying that. For a long time, I shied away from Leviticus like a North Dakotan farmer that you ask to talk about their feelings.
Oh my God.
Do you know any North Dakotan farmers, Paul?
I know nobody from North Dakota.
Oh my gosh, I'm married to one and his whole family is blessed and wonderful and North Dakotan farmers. But I will say, before we get off track, Paul, do you ever find that if you're avoiding something, God has a way of sort of plopping that thing in your lap?
Yeah, you always have to be careful what you don't like.
I know. That's always how it happens with me.
Yeah.
So for a long time, I was really uncomfortable with Ezekiel. Especially chapters 16 and 23. Like ever since the first time I read them, basically I wanted nothing to do with them. In my third year at Emory, I was a teaching associate for Dr. Carol Newsom in a class where she had assigned these two chapters, and I was super excited to see how she was going to deal with them. And she decided that I should take the lead in the class on that particular day.
Ta-da!
So, yeah, exactly. My first mini lecture as a teaching associate is on Ezekiel 16 and 23.
I want to listen to a recording of how that went.
Oh my gosh, I'm not even sure how it went. Like, I probably pretty poorly. But after that experience, I was never afraid of addressing those chapters again. So, for a long time now, full disclosure, I've had similar thoughts about the book of Leviticus, sort of like tap dancing around Leviticus in my presentations, like giving enough content to be helpful, but hoping no one would ask me any in-depth questions.
Yeah.
And I don't think I'm the only one who really feels that way. Did you know that we don't have a single First Reading podcast episode on the book of Leviticus?
Wow, that's like shocking, right?
I know, right? I that's exactly how I felt too. And actually I was feeling like kind of some shame about that.
Yeah.
So I went to the Working Preacher website, little shout out to our friends at Luther, because I wanted to find out when Leviticus appears in the lectionary and what goodies we've been missing. Do you know how often the book of Leviticus appears in the Revised Common Lectionary, Paul?
I have zero knowledge. I have no idea.
It shows up twice.
Wow, twice.
Only 2 times. And guess what? It's both from the same chapter. So we have So we have this week's Leviticus 19 verses 1 to 2, 15 to 18. And another Sunday they assign Leviticus 19 verses 1 to 2, 9 through 18.
Oh, that's exactly the same thing. Right?
Yeah, pretty much. You get a few extra verses in the second pericope, but one chapter in the whole book of Leviticus. Can you believe it?
Yeah, that's something else.
I know. I was stunned when I found out, because the book of Leviticus is absolutely vital to the rest of the Bible.
It is.
Yeah, one of my students once made the analogy that the book of Leviticus is to the Bible as world building is to comic books. If you know, right? Like that was my little shout out to Naomi Morgan there. When she said that, I was like, oh my gosh, you're absolutely right. Yeah. So if you don't get the book of Leviticus, you don't get the Bible and you don't get Jesus.
Yeah.
So a few months ago, I had a writing assignment plunked in my lap on, you guessed it, the book of Leviticus. So the more carefully that I've read the book, I'm convinced that it's not only an essential book, but it's also just a really beautiful book, just on its own merits.
Yeah.
You know, if you take the beginning of our pericope for today, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, this sounds like commandment. I'm holy, so you have to be holy too, because otherwise it's going to make me look bad. And that's part of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it also sort of feels like a yucky thing a parent might say to a kid about not embarrassing them in public, or vice versa, the kid saying to the parent about not embarrassing them in public, right?
That's right. Yeah, yeah. some kind of a reverse, way of checking on each other, right? Just
right, exactly. And that is part of it, but that's not the only way to understand this statement.
Yeah.
It can also be understood as promise, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the narrative of the Bible thus far, the Israelites have successfully escaped Egypt, but then they messed up with the whole golden calf episode at Sinai.
Mm-hmm.
And the book of Leviticus functions in the narrative as part of the whole sorting out of that mess.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to wonder if there was some doubt on the part of the people that they'd ever be really able to live in relationship with this mighty and magnificent God.
Mm-hmm.
And enter Leviticus 19, verse 2. You shall be holy, for
Mm-hmm.
I, the Lord your God, am holy.
Mm.
It's in some sense a word of promise.
Yeah.
That, simply by being in relationship with God, we are in some way made holy ourselves.
Mm.
And, I think this could be a preaching point, because your people may not feel like they come to holiness naturally.
Yeah.
Right? We may not feel that we come to holiness easily or
Mhm.
even comfortably.
Mm-hmm.
But at this moment, God assures the Israelites that in some sense, simple proximity to God is enough, and God's going to deal with the rest.
Yeah. Leviticus makes the relationship that they need to have with God possible.
Oh,
right?
exactly. That's a
Yeah.
And way to say it.
Nice.
And I think it's one of the reasons why I really believe that Leviticus is fundamental to the world building of the Bible.
Yeah.
If you don't understand this moment, you
Yeah.
don't understand the world. You don't
That's right.
understand how people could get close to Jesus, reach out and touch his cloaks, and be healed.
That's right.
You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy.
Yeah.
We're not made holy by our actions in Leviticus. We are made holy by our proximity to God.
Mm.
And Leviticus is about what it looks like then to live in a world characterized by our holiness instead of one characterized by our profanity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think with that insight, we start to understand why it's traditional for a Jewish child, when they are of age to start reading the Bible, to be first given this beautiful book, Vayikra, Leviticus.
That's right. Yeah, it is. It is in a good way an invitation, right?
Mm-hmm.
To
Yeah, exactly.
relationship with God, to stay here, but do it properly, right?
Yeah,
do
right.
it in a way that
exactly.
pleases God. Yeah. Well, anything else to share?
Well, I suppose I should, because otherwise we've only made it through 2 verses.
Yeah.
The next few verses lay out what it looks like to engage with the world through a veil of holiness.
Yeah.
It means approaching judgment without preconceived partiality, even when you really, really want the person that you don't like to be at fault.
Mm-hmm.
Being made holy means never using the power of your tongue to slander, even when that person on the internet totally deserves it.
Oh my God.
One of my dear professors, Rolf Jacobson, always says that the etymology of the word sarcasm leads back to an ancient Greek word sarkazane, which means to tear flesh.
Wow.
I think about that in the internet a lot.
Yes.
Being made holy, though, means taking God's love for humanity so seriously that you love your neighbor as you do your own flesh and blood. Are these things possible? Not always. But that's when we return to the promise that our proximity, our relationship to God, makes us holy and somehow makes these things a reality.
That's why it makes a whole lot of sense to think about this invitation as promise, right?
Yeah.
And not necessarily like a demand or a requirement or a command.
Exactly.
Right?
And it's a promise that's cyclical. So the closer you draw to God, the more you want to do these things, right? Like when I'm deep in my prayer life and in scripture, like I want to live the way God wants me to live.
Oh, yes.
Right?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
and the more you do these things, the closer you draw to God, because the more you start to see God's work in the world and God's love for this fallen humanity.
Yeah.
And, it's one of the reasons I love the Hebrew name of this book. Leviticus, that name actually comes from the Greek, referring to the scroll as the book of the Levites. In
Yeah.
Hebrew, both ancient and modern, the name of the book is Vayikra, and he
Yeah.
called.
Wow.
Leviticus is the world building moment where God makes us holy and calls us into creation, into relationship with both our creator and our neighbor. And that's just a beautiful calling with which to clothe yourself in a
Yeah.
world that is determined to wage war against love.
I don't think I'm ever going to think about Leviticus in the same way ever again. Like to think about it as an invitation, right?
Yeah.
Even implied in the name, the Hebrew name of it, like Vayikra, right?
Yeah.
It's so beautiful.
Yeah, it's drawing us rather than demanding us, and I just love that.
Exactly. Well, thanks, Rachel, for walking us through the beauty of Vayikra.
My pleasure.
Folks, that would do it for today. First Reading is produced by Rachel and me, along with Rosie Kandathal and Tim McNinch. You can learn more about us and find past episodes at our website, firstreadingpodcast.com. Check out merchandise on the website as well. And please, if you found this useful, donate to support this podcast. Leave us a comment on Facebook and be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, my name is Paul Essa.
And I'm Rachel Wren. Happy preaching.